us for a lovely introduction. And I would like to thank you for this opportunity and, opportunity to write a chapter and, now continue the discussion. So this is definitely exciting because also in the times of COVID, this it evolves, the practical advice and the application of it. So we'll start by kind of introductions, and we assume that everybody read the chapter. We're not going to test you on that, but still, hopefully at least some of you have. And we'll rehash some of those discussion points from the chapter, but contribute also new ones and kind of the ones that have come up over and over again. So in lieu of introductions, my name is Svetlana and, in 20 minutes, I will test Matt to pronounce my last name. But I have been in the field of evaluation now for over 15 years, but more kind of monitoring and evaluation. And as a big disclaimer, I'm actually not a consultant anymore. I have gone on the other side, but don't hold it against me. I do hire a lot of consultants. I would say in the last 2 years, I think I've hired probably, 30 consultants for different assignments. So I bring that expertise as well. I worked originally as a staff in US for USAID funded project on data collection, and then I started consulting because I had to follow my husband and move to Africa. And this is where kind of I've expanded my portfolio from USAID to others. And then I worked for different organizations, came back to DC, also was staff. So I was consulting and being staff. And eventually, in my last 2 assignments, I was with the African Development Bank in the evaluation office. So again, hiring consultants and consultant firms. And I recently transitioned to Rome to CGIR, which is the Agricultural Research Organization. And in the last 6 months, in the first 6 months of my assignment here, I managed a team of 20 consultants. So I'm definitely happy to kind of build on what we shared in the book and also kind of rehash all of this with you again. Thank you. Nils.
And my name is Nils Young. I also have a tricky last name. It's in Europe, I pronounce it Junge, but in the US, it's basically the American version of Young. And had I been born in Canada, I would have been Neil Young, but that name was already taken. So my career is somewhat less illustrious. I have a background in international relations. I've been working as an independent consultant since the year 2000, and I've lived in Washington, D.C. since then. I've conducted about over 60 evaluations in more than 40 countries. I've never worked in the U.S., so I have no domestic experience. My clients are mostly the U.S. government, so that's USAID, Millennium Challenge Corporation, and the State Department, and then the World Bank is another big client, and some other multilateral development banks. So basically, what I'm doing is evaluating how effective our taxpayer dollars are being used for foreign aid. But don't think of this as charity, it's not humanitarian, it's aid, it's really a development assistance. So yeah, that's my hobby is foreign languages, which comes in handy. Working overseas also creates some pitfalls because it's very useful to know a foreign language, and I'll get into that in a second. But there are degrees of proficiency that have an impact on your work. So a little bit about the chapter and overview. This is the one that Svetlana and I wrote. First of all, I also want to thank Matt for encouraging us to write the chapter and providing very valuable feedback. And yes, we did have to cut quite a bit. That was probably just as hard as the writing process, deciding what to cut out. But that's got to fit it into those 10 or 11 pages. So basically, we framed the discussion around overcoming barriers or divides in international evaluation work because we realized that we we spend a lot of our time as consultants dealing with them, maybe unconsciously, but they're always there. There's the work itself, which is, on the technical and operational side of evaluations. There's the subject matter, right? Health, energy, agriculture, what have you. And then there's all the other stuff, language, culture, power. And let me switch slides to see if I can. Okay, here we go. There's all these other things that are peripheral to the actual evaluation you're doing, but are very important, right? So language, the national, international barrier, culture, privilege, power, gender, geography, which we'll get into. And you want to make these work for you, not against you, right? So figuring out how to manage those things and navigate them is very important. And these issues, they don't feature in the evaluation reports that you write, right? This is these are all the externalities. But we find that they're very important in order to, achieve the results that you're aiming for. So in the chapter, we reflect on these things, on what we've learned, on how we and others have dealt with them. I think the main thing to keep in mind is that they're not obstacles. These are not divides. These are not barriers that stop you from doing your work, but they really can hinder your work, or they can make your life more difficult. But we take a positive spin on these, right? So we see them as opportunities to learn and be a more reflective and effective independent consultant. Because you're not part of an organization, you can't count on the institutional support that the State Department or the World Bank or a big NGO would be giving you. So you often have to figure out these things on your own. So, to take the first one on the list, language as an example, how much of a barrier is it? On the one hand, it is a real barrier. If you don't speak, let's say, French or Spanish, you're much less likely to find work in West Africa or Latin America. And then, when you do work in a country where you don't speak the language, you rely on an interpreter, and on that interpreter's skills and willingness to translate everything. Often they may provide you a summary, so you're missing out on a lot of the nuances. They're using their own judgment. So that is a barrier. And I do speak a bunch of foreign languages. As I said, it's a hobby of mine, and I grew up in different cultures, but mostly conversationally, right? So I don't speak any at the the very high formal level, which is used in meetings, let's say, with government. That's a very different level of communication. So it's great, while chatting with colleagues, it's fun. You can go out for dinner afterwards and in informal meetings. But in fact, at a formal meeting, you actually can be at a disadvantage if you only know the language conversationally, depending on how well you know the people sitting across the table from you. So in those cases, I do prefer to speak English and have an interpreter. But on the other hand, language is not really a barrier if you are competent at what you do, right? I would not say that not knowing a foreign language or not knowing the foreign language in the country you're working on will hold you back. Maybe initially fewer opportunities will come your way when you're starting out. So, you can't, let's say, use your language ability to compensate for your lack of experience, right? If you're new to the profession. But as you gain experience, your technical areas of expertise, evaluation or subject matter will be more than enough to compensate for any lack of language abilities. And then just learning a few words or phrases, as I'm sure all of you who have been abroad know, it's a great way of breaking down those barriers. And then really, what's really important is connecting with counterparts, connecting with the people in the countries where you're working, whether they are on your team, local consultants, or bureaucrats, or staff at the agencies. And I found that, that connection can be based on anything you have in common, whether it's, you're both engineers, for example, or you both like football, or you have kids, it can be anything. And that's actually probably even more important than the language ability. Then, in terms of another divide that we talk about is, the international versus the national divide. So you are an international consultant coming into another country, but you work with locals, nationals, right? And I think it's very important to remember that everybody brings valuable skills to the table, right? So internationals bring their international experience, their familiarity with donor requirements, say English language skills, while nationals bring their local knowledge, right? So they have cultural knowledge. They let's say they know the energy sector very well. They have their local networks, and obviously they speak the local language. And you really don't want to underestimate that. So it's very important to see that as you both bring important skills to the table, and it's really an exchange, right? So you may be constrained by your relative ignorance, especially if you're new to country, and they may be constrained maybe by their local social networks. They have to remain in the country after you've wrapped up your evaluation and have left. So being part of a local network can also act as a constraint. So, building relationships, and I'm going to talk a little bit about culture before handing it off to Svetlana, it's super important. Because, the equation that I like, that I have in my mind is, communication leads to a relationship leads to trust, and that trust is key for effective collaboration and information sharing. Now, a lot of that comes from informal engagement, right? So here's where the familiarity or lack of familiarity with local norms, with the local culture, is something that you need to be aware of and overcome. Until you do that, you may find yourself making assumptions about local colleagues. It's often the case that the local consultant that you're working with is earning a fraction of your daily rate. Let's say, their English maybe isn't so great, but they could be very well connected politically. They may actually have a higher status in the country than you do at home, right? And they're also going to be making assumptions about you, what you as a foreigner know or care about, right? So in some cultures, for example, bonding, team building, because I'm almost always on a team when I'm working on these assignments, involves alcohol. So, especially in Eastern Europe, right? Like drinks after work, even during the day. If you don't drink, that's just something that's, going to be an issue. Or sometimes they may be testing you. Like how close to our culture is this consultant willing to come? Their gender comes into play. Let Svetlana talk about that, right? With different expectations about men and women. I've even had tricky situations where local colleagues were proposing not just drinks and dinner, but going to a sauna to celebrate, completion of an assignment, complete with members of the opposite sex. So there's tricky situations that you sometimes need to extricate yourself from. But with that, let me turn it back to Svetlana, who will talk about some of the other divides that we've identified. Thanks.
Thank you, Nils. And thank you, colleagues, for listening. And actually, just as a small sidestep, I noticed that some of you have had international experiences as well. So feel free to also, put your thoughts and experiences in chat, and we can discuss them later, because, clearly we're not the kings of the universe, and we know everybody has very different experiences. So I will cover the kind of the last three bullet points on this slide, and relate to privilege, power, gender. Those are very much kind of connected in more ways than one. And of course, geography, which is different dimension than kind of international and national. So, our chapter was written, I believe, before the Black Lives Matter started as a movement. But, clearly a lot of these topics have been brought to bear, so much more brightly in the US as well, but they also are big when you work in the international development evaluations. And it's very important for an evaluator to be aware of their identity, their membership, and privilege and power when they come in. And it's not necessarily about money, but it's just about where they sit in their own societies and vis-a-vis the beneficiaries and people they interact. AA's public statement on cultural competencies and evaluation goes back to 2011, and it calls for recognizing the dynamics of power. And this, basically is forever relevant, and it's relevant in the international development. So the interactions, as Nils said, you would have on a daily basis when you are engaged in the consultancies are with individuals of different stratas of the society or levels of the society, and some of them might be higher than even you are at home, or some may be lower. And humans have many positive qualities, but we also can have our own biases, and that we should not bring this into our work. And unfortunately, and there is a big movement in the evaluation around that, with the focus on indigenous evaluations, the focus on Western values in project goals and conditions are also followed by approaches to evaluations, which are really important to consider. Evaluators have the power to choose what questions to ask, what questions are important, and to whom to ask. And in that way, not without even realizing the full depth of the dynamics, power dynamics in a country, it's important to be aware that they exist, and also respect them and engage in any way possible when you conduct an evaluation. And so the international, in the evaluation, you have to draw from a combination of resources and the autonomy, and consider the financial equity, human, and other dimensions. While it is true that evaluators have the status of educated foreigners, often to imagine that they are the only actors with privilege and power would be inaccurate. In fact, a lot of times when you go to the countries and interact with individuals, especially at ministries and at different types of institutions, they might be more educated, and the status and PhD, for example, are much more prevalent than probably among some of the evaluators. And it's very often that creates the maybe different type of power dynamics. And power dynamics also are related to discussing the money, as Nils said, and this is really important because it creates and disbalances this type of interactions. Often power dynamics will be hidden from evaluators unless we have a particular grounding in this particular culture, and we do our homework in advance or in a particular setting. For example, the poor woman in Tajik village with whom you are connecting during the interview might be answering questions in a way that will please you and the process, but the family dynamics towards her daughter-in-law might be very different and not so positive. And it's important not to judge people and be able to basically kind of save your face and be very careful of expressing what you feel and the assumptions that you make, and not bring the biases, your cultural biases from your backgrounds. And everywhere, at the end of the day, treating everyone you can encounter with respect and neutrality is a useful principle to follow across. And very much related to privilege and power are gender divides. And again, I can see that here on this meeting today, we have predominantly females, which is kind of interesting. I find it, maybe we'll discuss this a little bit later. And in the international development, it's a really big area of focus, and not just about, exploration of gender in evaluations, but also for identities and evaluators. And I'm talking from my own experience as a woman. And gender roles are at the core of cultural differences globally. And there's no way to kind of get away from that. So basically domestically and internationally. And we know that very obviously. I'm sure that you can share experiences. So due to gender norms in some cultures, sectors, work environments, some, there might be some men working in one versus more women working in another. It's very often that women are not part of field teams, for example, because young women are not allowed to overnight somewhere. So even if you want to have a gender balanced team, for data collection, it might be just not possible because they would not be allowed to leave their houses. And at the same time, at a certain age, when they're at the age of when women are starting to have kids, again, if they have, 3 kids or 4 kids in some countries, that's a norm, even in very educated and rich families, then they might still not be, able to actually leave. So aiming for this gender balance in teams is important, but it requires extra work. And kind of bringing us to geography, and this goes to also relates to what Nils was discussing, is of course, working between countries is important. Working in different regions, that's the nature of what we are discussing. But also consider there are issues or there are, vaccinations, visas, all those things cannot be taken as easy. And, now maybe with the COVID passports coming in, there will be other challenges, but those things need to be considered, and a lot of homework needs to be done in advance. And you have to be prepared that, to go to Africa, you have to have a yellow fever vaccine, for example. So this type of issues are really important. And the economy class versus business class. Not all international development consultants are entitled to that, to the business class for long flights on some really small airlines and some really small planes. So those are things just to be aware. And again, they're not barriers, but they're learning moments. Nils, I think you can pick up.
Yep.
Next. Oh, no. So this is just, on the slide where we kind of give some maybe ideas of anxieties that you might have experienced when if you consider joining this exciting world of international development consulting and evaluation field, and, some mitigation mitigation strategies. So the foreign language and experiences, we already covered. It's the big one, and I'm sure a lot of you might think about it, but learning about countries, regions, and funders in the region is really important. You can definitely engage without knowing the language, but you can show appreciation of a culture, even without showing the language. So this cannot be undervalued, basically. For example, I had an experience when I was going to Maldives for a consulting gig, and it was I don't know how many of you have been there, but it did not strike me ever that it's a Muslim country, and actually it's a dry country, and you have to cover your shoulders when you come in. So I did not do my homework because there's this perception of Maldives as not being that. So doing your homework is very important. The missing international development evaluation experience is, of course, also probably why some of you on this call, but would consider joining the field. The credentials are really important to some people in our sector. Credentials for AAA, which is not doing the credentialing like our colleagues up north in Canada, but those are actually very well respected in a lot of countries. And the respect comes from the evalu lens. If they see that you are a credentialed evaluator. Some of you, I don't know if you've heard about IPDET, but it's a program about evaluation kind of course that was originally started with the World Bank, but it's now kind of headquartered in Geneva in Switzerland with the university. But it's something that if you don't have international experience, actually helps you kind of break into this field to solidify your knowledge, but also kind of join this network. And I know some people were able to actually get their first consulting in international field after they did IPDAP without previous experience. And of course, lacking international network. And again, it's a small evaluation world. I'm sure there is in US. I haven't worked in the US, but using LinkedIn and calling for your colleagues from universities and seeing who works for which organization always helps, because you never know where they might be working. And it might help you to get your first assignment. Mm-hmm. We can continue. And here come COVID times. So in that one, it's really a new challenge for all of us in many different ways, but it's also a great opportunity. And I'm sure that a lot of you have already shifted gears in one way or another, but it could definitely open windows. First of all, you have time to attend webinars and presentations, probably more than before. And we have time to give those because we don't have to jump on airplanes. And this kind of brings everybody together in one global world. So it helps you to learn about the field and how it's done in international development, and just be aware of the opportunities and organizations that work. There is a wide majority of work has gone remote in any field and international as well, because nobody can travel. And so for some, it's easier. For parents, for example, who might have not been able to take travel gigs, now they can. And they can do this remotely. However, of course, the parenting challenges due to school closures are also real. However, I look at it as more of an opportunity, and I do have a 5-year-old, so I've faced some challenges, but I think it's good time to also open new venues. And of course, more work focused on COVID because development programs, and this is something that just where volume-wise, there is a lot more work and COVID response, and there's more money going into certain types of programs. So all this opens new opportunities. And I think I can move us forward. So we've put a list together, a list of resources for those who want to start or who want to kind of learn more, maybe if you haven't considered. So the big one, and this is kind of why we're here, who we are. We are the VOPE, which is Voluntary Organization of Professionalization and Evaluation, which is American Evaluation Association. But engaging with other VOPEs at your city level, and Nils and I were living in Washington, D.C., or I was living in Washington, D.C., and Washington Evaluators, for example, is very heavily focused on international development consultancies. And also professional VOPEs are also really important, like Eval Forward. It's the Eval community for agriculture and research development. And there are others that are gender ones. There's Eval Gender Plus. So there are others where you can join, depending on your area of expertise and areas of interest. Peregrine Discussion Group, former Pelican, which was now of Better Evaluation Platform. Probably some of you know Better Evaluation Platform, but their listserv is actually very heavily international evaluation consulting focused, and discussions are really insightful. A lot of opportunities for consulting and jobs now that all they say remote. So again, great. LinkedIn and Facebook groups, also there are plenty. 50 Shades of Aid is a good group to join, where you just can learn about the life of international development, consultancies and staff positions, and a lot of other insights into this work. And of course, DevX, Development Aid, those are platforms that are really rich in what they provide, which kind of resources. And for those are US-based, and majority of like Washington, D.C., kind of called Beltway Bandits, is USAID contractors. There are also lists of top vendors, and it does vary by, of course, by year and by priorities of the administrations. And it will be changing in the next year or two heavily. So, so we invite you to monitor those and go. And I'll let Nils also to kind of continue on that one, because he's much closer to the USAID world than I am now.
Thanks, Svetlana. So Matt, it's now, I want to make sure we manage our time properly. It's 12:35, or depending where you are.